The city of New York had learned to live under a very particular kind of sky. It was not the sky of storms or of quiet mornings. It was the sky of Vought, painted every hour with the smiling face of Homelander projected across skyscraper billboards wrapped around buses, printed on the sides of coffee cups. People had grown used to the idea that the powerful lived above them, that heroes were something you subscribed to, and that safety was a product you were sold whether you wanted it or not. It was a world where cameras never blinked, where every act of rescue was staged with 3 angles and a marketing team, and where the man in the red, white, and blue cape looked down at humanity the way a landlord looks down at tenants who are late on rent. On the afternoon this story truly begins, that sky cracked. It did not crack the way a storm cracks it. It cracked the way glass does when something on the other side has finally decided to come through. A single seam of impossible light opened above Midtown, and for a moment the city forgot how to breathe. Traffic stopped. Pigeons scattered. A Vought news drone hovered so close to the tier that its lens shattered. And then, from that wound in the world, a man fell. He did not fall the way people fall. He dropped through the air with the calm posture of someone stepping out of a taxi. A long red coat caught the wind behind him. Twin pistols glinted at his hips. A massive sword rested across his back as if it weighed nothing. His white hair whipped around a face that carried the faintest smile, the smile of a man who has already seen every terrifying thing a universe can offer and found most of it disappointing. He landed in the middle of a Vought-controlled operation, cracked the pavement with his boots, straightened his coat, and looked around at the smoking cars and terrified onlookers with mild interest. His name was Dante. Within minutes, Vought analysts were pulling every camera in a 10-block radius. Within an hour, executives were shouting into phones. Within 2, Homelander was in the air, curious rather than concerned. He had spent so long being the answer to every question that the sudden arrival of a new one intrigued him more than it worried him. Another Supe, he assumed. Another enhanced human to be intimidated, recruited, or quietly disposed of, depending on how the focus groups leaned. The first team of Vought-controlled Supes hit Dante within the hour. They came in fast, expecting the usual choreography of a public takedown, expecting the newcomer to freeze, to plead, to flinch. Instead, Dante tilted his head as if listening to a joke only he could hear. He stepped aside from the first punch. He ducked beneath the second. He caught the third with one hand and looked genuinely puzzled that anyone had thrown it. Cameras tried to keep up and failed. He moved between attacks the way wind moves between fingers, and he talked the entire time, complimenting one Supe's haircut, asking another where a good pizza place might be, telling a third that the costume was quite loud for daytime. When the last of them was groaning on the asphalt, Homelander finally descended. He came down slowly, deliberately, letting the sunlight halo behind him the way it always did on the posters. He landed with the practice weight of a man who had rehearsed his own presence in mirrors. He waited for the flicker of fear. He waited for the small stunned breath. He waited for the eyes to widen the way eyes always widened when he arrived. Dante looked up at him the way you look at a mildly interesting statue in a park you were walking through. Not afraid, not impressed, not even particularly curious. For the first time in years, something inside Homelander shifted uncomfortably. It was a small feeling, so small he could almost pretend he had not felt it at all. It was the feeling of being seen and not being feared. It was the feeling of a mirror that had, for one strange moment, refused to reflect him. Dante offered a small wave. He asked if the man in the cape was in charge around here, and if so, whether there was someone slightly less shiny he could speak to instead. The nearest cameraman went pale. A publicist somewhere in a distant office spilled coffee across a keyboard. Homelander smiled the way he always smiled when he was calculating how to hurt someone without being caught. But the smile arrived a beat too late, and everyone who mattered had already noticed the delay. Above them, the crimson seam in the sky slowly closed, leaving only a faint shimmer, as if the universe itself was already regretting what it had let through. Below, the city held its breath, sensing without understanding that something had shifted in the balance of things. And in the middle of it all stood a stranger in a red coat who had already fought worse than any of them could imagine, who had walked out of a place where gods bled and demons prayed, and who now regarded the crown jewel of Vought incorporated with the patient boredom of a man waiting for a bus. The central question of everything that would follow was already forming quietly in the air between them. What happens when a man who has fought actual demons enters a world where superheroes only pretend to be gods? Homelander did not know the question yet, but somewhere behind his perfect blue eyes the answer had already begun to frighten him. The morning after Dante's arrival, the 72nd floor of Vought Tower looked like a hive that had been kicked. Analysts moved between glass-walled rooms carrying tablets that would not stop refreshing. Legal teams argued in corners. Public relations executives rehearsed 3 different versions of the same statement, unsure whether to call the stranger a threat, a guest, or a marketing opportunity. In the center of it all, Stan Edgar sat at the head of a long table, hands folded, expression unreadable, listening as scientist after scientist admitted the same uncomfortable truth. They had no idea what Dante was. There was no compound V signature in his blood. There was no recognizable genetic modification in his cells. His weapons did not match any known metallurgy on file. His healing did not follow any biological curve they could plot. When they tried to measure his strength, the instruments returned readings that the machines themselves refused to accept. One young researcher whispered, more to herself than to the room, that it was like trying to weigh a thunderstorm. Stan Edgar did not smile, but he made a note. Vought did what Vought always did. It reached for the checkbook. An emissary was sent, dressed in the kind of suit that cost more than most apartments, carrying a folder full of numbers designed to make ordinary men weep. Dante was found sitting on the edge of a rooftop with his boots dangling over the street, eating a slice of pizza he had somehow already procured. He listened politely as the offer was made. He asked, with genuine curiosity, whether that was a lot of money in this universe. When told that it was, he laughed. It was a warm laugh, unhurried, the laugh of a man who had never once measured his life in currency. He handed the folder back and offered the emissary a bite of the pizza. They tried fame next. They offered a documentary, a merchandise line, a spot at the next Vought convention with his own panel. Dante laughed harder. He told them with great sincerity that if he wanted people to know his name, he would simply do something interesting in front of a lot of them. It was, he said, how it had always worked where he came from. Finally, on the 3rd meeting, they offered him a seat among the 7. They spoke of legacy, of history, of the greatest superhero team the world had ever known. Dante listened to the entire pitch with the patient expression of a man being told a bedtime story he had already outgrown. Then he politely declined, and as he stood to leave, he turned back at the door and told them very gently that their costumes were among the most embarrassing things he had ever seen, and that he had once fought a demon dressed as a jester. Word of the newcomer moved through the city in the way all real news moved, quietly, through the people who were not supposed to notice. In a basement several miles from Vought Tower, Billy Butcher heard the story from a contact who had watched the rooftop meeting through a long lens. Butcher's first assumption was the simplest one. Another Supe. Another arrogant, dangerous, overpowered narcissist who would eventually need to be put down. He poured himself a drink and began planning. Huey was less convinced. He had watched the footage of the fight in the street. He had seen the way Dante moved and, more importantly, the way Dante had not moved. There had been no cruelty in it, no performance, no hunger for the cameras. Just a man doing something difficult with the ease of long practice and joking his way through it the way tired workers joke their way through long shifts. Huey began quietly gathering everything he could find, and the more he found, the stranger the picture became. Dante was not looking for territory. He was not looking for followers. He was not, as far as anyone could tell, looking for anything at all except a way home. He moved through the city like a tourist who had accidentally taken the wrong train, asking strange questions in bookstores, staring at neon signs, tasting street food with the delight of a man who had not realized he was hungry. He paid for things. He held doors open. He tipped generously with coins that did not quite match any currency Huey could identify. But then, slowly, something began to change in the way Dante walked through the city. He started noticing. He noticed the children in the Vought-sponsored hospital wing, the ones whose parents had signed papers they had not been allowed to read, the ones whose small bodies now carried powers that made them scream in their sleep. He noticed the families standing in front of collapsed apartment buildings, holding photographs of people who had been standing in the wrong place when a Supe decided to make an entrance. He noticed the way the police cordons always went up quickly around Supe incidents, the way witnesses were quietly ushered away, the way the news the next morning always described the same events using words that made the victims sound like weather. He noticed Homelander on the giant screen, smiling that impossible smile, waving at crowds that had been paid to cheer, promising safety to people who had learned to fear him more than they feared anything he claimed to protect them from. Dante had come from a world of literal demons. He had spent his life fighting creatures that had no interest in hiding what they were. Their hunger was open, their cruelty was honest. You knew when you drew your blade exactly what you were killing and exactly why. What he was seeing here was something different, and in a strange way, something worse. Here the monsters wore capes. Here the monsters were beloved. Here the monsters had marketing teams. One night, on a quiet rooftop overlooking a street where a Vought cleanup crew was scrubbing blood off a sidewalk, Dante sat for a long time without speaking. The wind moved through his red coat. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword. He was not smiling anymore. He was not frowning either. He was doing something rarer for him. He was thinking. He had told himself when he first fell through the sky that he would find his way home and leave this strange, loud place behind. He had told himself it was not his fight. He had told himself that the people here had their own heroes, however ridiculous they looked. But as he watched the cleanup crew work in the light of Homelander's face burning on a billboard across the street, he felt something familiar stir inside him. Not rage, not yet. Something older than rage. The recognition of a pattern. People who believed power made them untouchable. People who had convinced themselves that the small ones did not count. Dante exhaled slowly. He stood. He looked once more at the smiling billboard. And for the first time since he had arrived, his smile matched it tooth for tooth, but with something behind his eyes that Vought's cameras would not have known how to sell. He was going to stay a while longer. Homelander did not sleep the way other men slept. He rested in short, restless stretches, always half aware of the sounds of the tower around him, always half listening for the small failures of the people he ruled. But in the days after the stranger in the red coat had landed in his city, something new began happening in those quiet hours. He would close his eyes and see, very clearly, a small polite wave. He would hear a calm voice asking without malice whether there was someone slightly less shiny to speak to. And he would open his eyes again, staring at the ceiling, and find that his jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. He told himself he was curious. He told himself he was studying an opponent. He told himself, over and over, that a man like him did not become obsessed. And then in the morning he would put on his cape and go looking for Dante again. At first the encounters were small. Homelander would appear in the sky above a street where Dante happened to be walking, hovering just high enough to be dramatic, just low enough to be seen. Dante would glance up, wave the way a neighbor waves at another neighbor's dog, and keep walking. Homelander would appear on a rooftop where Dante was eating, sit down across from him, and try to fill the silence with the practiced menace of a man who had rehearsed his own reputation. Dante would offer him a fry. The intimidation attempts grew larger. Homelander began describing, in careful low tones, all the terrible things he could do to a person if he chose to. He described what heat vision did to bone. He described the sound a spine made when the pressure was just right. He described, with the quiet pride of a craftsman, the ways he had made men disappear. Dante listened to all of it with the patient interest of a man being told about someone else's hobby. When Homelander finished, Dante nodded, complimented the vocabulary, and asked whether he had ever considered writing a book. The physical demonstrations began after that. Homelander would rise into the air in front of Dante, arms open, sunlight catching every crease of his uniform, and hang there like a living monument. He would let the wind move his cape. He would let his eyes glow. He would wait for the small, stunned breath that always came. Dante would tilt his head. He would ask, gently, whether that was supposed to impress him, because if it was, he had once seen a demon 3 times that size do a very similar trick, and even the demon had been slightly embarrassed about it. Something inside Homelander was cracking, and it was not the part of him he had learned to guard. The truth, though Homelander would not have said it aloud, was that his entire life had been built on a very specific transaction. He performed power and other people performed fear. That was the contract. The billboards, the crowds, the applause, the trembling executives, the whispered gratitude of politicians, all of it was just the machinery of that single exchange. Fear paid for everything he was, and Dante, without apparent effort, refused to pay. The psychological battle became more important than any physical one. Homelander began losing small hours of his day to it. He would stand at the window of Vought Tower and stare at the skyline and try to remember what it had felt like, only a few weeks earlier, to know without doubt that he was the most frightening thing in any room he entered. He could not quite recover the feeling. It sat just out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue. Finally, he decided to end it publicly. If private confrontations would not break the stranger, then a public one surely would. Vought would arrange an event. A staged confrontation choreographed carefully with just enough danger to feel real and just enough control to guarantee the outcome. Thousands would watch. The cameras would be everywhere. Dante would be humiliated in front of the world, and the world would remember, once again, exactly who its god was. The day of the event arrived under a bright, unhelpful sun. The plaza in front of Vought Tower had been transformed into something between a concert and a coronation. Banners hung from every window. Music thundered from speakers the size of cars. A crowd of tens of thousands filled the streets, waving flags, holding signs, cheering on cue. Homelander walked onto the stage to a roar so loud it rattled the glass in nearby buildings. He smiled the smile that had sold 1 billion cups of coffee, and he waited. Dante arrived on foot. He walked through the crowd the way a man walks through a field of tall grass, gently, without hurry, occasionally reaching out to shake a hand or accept a child's offered flower. By the time he reached the stage, the cheering had begun to falter, replaced by a strange, curious hush. He climbed the steps as calmly as if he had been invited. He looked at Homelander. He smiled. Homelander struck first. The heat vision came in a scream of red light, hot enough to melt steel, focused enough to punch through a tank. Dante turned his head at the last possible instant, and the beam carved a black line across the stage behind him, missing his cheek by less than an inch. He did not flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "Is that the opening move?" What followed was less a fight than a lesson. Homelander tore through the plaza at speeds that turned him into a blur. Dante moved with him, always half a step ahead, always guiding the fight away from the crowd. Homelander sent him through the front of a building. Dante walked back out of the rubble, brushing dust from his coat, still smiling. Homelander lifted a car and threw it at him. Dante stepped aside, caught the car by its bumper and set it down gently on the road so as not to damage it further. And then, when Homelander finally paused, breathing hard for the first time in years, Dante did something the cameras would replay for months afterward. He drew rebellion. The great blade came free of its sheath with a sound that was not quite metal. The crowd fell silent. Even the speakers, still blaring their pre-approved anthem, seemed suddenly quieter. Dante rested the flat of the blade against his shoulder and looked up at Homelander with the same calm expression he had worn on the first day. Homelander understood something in that moment that he had spent his entire life avoiding. Dante was not fighting to prove he was stronger. Dante was not fighting to be worshipped. Dante was fighting because he genuinely, deeply, sincerely did not believe that Homelander was dangerous enough to frighten him. The cameras caught the exact instant Homelander's public smile slipped. It was only a fraction of a second. It was enough. Somewhere in a small apartment across the city, an old woman watching the broadcast leaned forward and whispered, for the first time in her long life, that maybe the man in the cape was not a god after all. The rivalry did not end that day, but something else did. Billy Butcher watched the footage from the plaza 37 times in a single night. He watched it forward. He watched it backward. He watched it in slow motion, frame by frame, pausing on the moment Homelander's smile faltered. He drank steadily as he watched, but the drink did not soften what he was seeing. It sharpened it. Somewhere around the 20th replay, he set the glass down without finishing it, which for Butcher was almost a religious act, and began to think about the stranger in the red coat with a kind of focus he usually reserved for enemies. He did not care about recruiting Dante. He did not care about befriending him. He did not care whether the man was good, bad, or somewhere in the useful gray between. What he cared about, and had always cared about, was one thing: whether Dante could be turned into a weapon aimed at Homelander. Everything else was noise. The boys began working the problem the way they always worked problems, in fragments, from many directions at once. Mother's Milk pulled every scrap of footage from every angle of every public sighting. Frenchie began analyzing the weapons, studying the pistols and the great sword and the way they seemed to move differently than physics would allow. Kimiko watched Dante silently on a laptop late at night and, in her own quiet way, decided that she liked him. Hui, who had a gift for asking the questions no one else thought to ask, began investigating Dante's biology. That was when the picture began to twist. The blood samples Huey's contact had managed to scrape from a stage barrier came back from the private lab with a note attached from the technician. The note used the word interesting, then the word impossible, then a small drawing of a question mark. The blood was not enhanced. It was not modified. It carried no traces of compound V, no viral vectors, no synthetic markers, no signs of any of the pharmaceutical engineering Vought had spent decades perfecting. And yet on every test that measured what a cell should be capable of, the blood returned numbers that read like typographical errors. Regeneration rates that were not rates but constants. Energy signatures that resembled nothing so much as the readings scientists had once recorded from certain rare geological events. Deep in old volcanic rock, when the Earth itself seemed to remember things older than the men measuring it. Frenchie's report on the weapons arrived next, written on the back of a napkin in 3 languages. The sword was not made of any known metal. The pistols fired projectiles that appeared to leave no measurable residue. When one of the bullets was recovered from a wall, it dissolved within an hour of being placed on a table, leaving behind a faint scorched circle and a smell that Frenchie described only as memory of fire. Mother's Milk assembled the pieces into a single quiet sentence and read it aloud in the safe house. Whatever Dante was, he was not a super. The room did not immediately respond. Butcher stared at the wall for a long time. Huey glanced toward the window, half expecting to see Dante standing there. Kimiko, who had already decided this, went back to eating her cereal. They spent the next several days learning what they could about the world Dante had come from, though the pieces came slowly. In fragments Dante himself let slip during casual conversations Huey carefully engineered. He mentioned in passing a tower that had never stopped burning. He mentioned a brother whose name he said only once, quietly, as if the name still had weight. He mentioned demons the way a plumber mentions pipes, with the casual expertise of a man who had spent his life inside a particular trade. He mentioned that he had died more than once and had not found the experience especially memorable. The more Butcher learned, the less comfortable he became. He had built his entire war on the belief that Supes, however powerful, were still men. Compound V was a chemical. Chemicals could be neutralized. Enhanced humans could be tracked, cornered, killed. His entire strategy depended on that fundamental fact. Dante did not fit inside that fact. Dante existed outside it. And Butcher, who had spent a lifetime learning to hate everything Vought had ever produced, found himself facing an uncomfortable realization. The most dangerous being currently walking through his city was not one of Vaught's creations at all. Meanwhile, deep inside a Vought research facility 3 floors below sea level, other men were reaching similar conclusions and choosing very different responses. The scientists there had been given a directive from Stan Edgar himself. Understand him, replicate him, own him. They studied the same footage, ran the same numbers, and, with the desperate optimism of men whose careers depended on results, began an experiment. They took Compound V, the compound that had built Vaught's empire, and they combined it with what little dimensional residue their instruments had been able to capture from the sites of Dante's fights. Faint traces on scorched pavement, strange particles clinging to broken glass, air samples from rooms he had recently left. The first test subjects were volunteers, chosen from the ranks of Vaught's less visible employees, men and women who had signed contracts they had not been allowed to read carefully. They were promised power. They were promised a place at the table. They were injected in white rooms under white lights, and for a few minutes, everything seemed to be working. Then their skin began to move in ways skin should not move. Their voices began to layer, as if more than one thing were speaking at once. One of them tore a steel door from its frame and used it to kill 3 orderlies before the containment team arrived. Another simply sat in the corner and wept, saying over and over that something else was in the room with him and that it was very hungry. Dante found out about the experiments almost by accident, from a Vought janitor who had been paid too little for too long and who slipped Huey a data drive in exchange for a promise of relocation. Huey brought the drive to Dante on a rooftop at dusk, unsure how the man in the red coat would react. Dante did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He read the files in the dim glow of Huey's laptop, scrolling slowly, his expression barely changing. Only his hand, resting on the hilt of rebellion, tightened almost imperceptibly. When he finally looked up, the smile was gone. What replaced it was something Huey had not seen on Dante's face before. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was decision. He was not angry, he said quietly, because Vought had tried to copy his powers. Powers could be copied. Powers could be stolen. That did not particularly bother him. What bothered him was that they had used people. Real people with names, with families, with lives as raw material for their curiosity. He looked out at the city, at the towers and the billboards and the smiling faces on the screens. Whatever he had told himself about leaving quietly, he said, was no longer true. The lower levels of the Vought research facility were built to contain almost anything. The walls were reinforced with alloys developed in secret defense contracts. The doors were rated for blasts that would flatten a city block. The scientists who worked there wore badges color-coded to their clearance, ate in a cafeteria that had no windows, and were required to sign paperwork every morning acknowledging that they might not go home that night. They believed, in the quiet way that all people believe when they work in places like that whatever they were doing was still, somehow, under control. They were wrong. The experiment that broke the world began, as most disasters do, with a decision made by men in a room with good coffee. They would increase the dosage. They would refine the sample. They would try again one more time, because the last attempt had shown promising instability, and instability, in Vought's language, was another word for progress. The subject that morning was a middle-aged security consultant named Harold, who had a wife and a small dog and a modest apartment in Queens, and who had been told that this test was routine. They injected the new compound into Harold's arm at 11:17 in the morning. By 11:19, the lights in the observation room began to flicker. By 11:20, the monitors that had been reading Harold's vital signs went dark, then bright, then dark again in a pattern that no one in the room could explain. By 11:21, the air in the sealed chamber began to shimmer, as if heat were rising from a road on a summer afternoon, though the temperature had not changed. And by 11:22, a small hole had appeared in the air above Harold's body. It was no wider than a coin. It was black. It was breathing. The senior scientist gave the order to seal the facility. The order arrived several seconds too late. Something on the other side of the small hole had already begun to push its way through, and the hole was no longer small. The creature that emerged did not look the way movie creatures look. It did not roar. It did not pose. It arrived quietly, the way a fire arrives in a house at night, and by the time anyone realized it was in the room, most of the room was already gone. It did not have a shape the way animals have shapes. It had suggestions of a shape, arranged around a center of hunger, and the parts of it that touched the walls did not scratch them. They unmade them. Steel forgot how to be steel. Concrete forgot how to be concrete. A young technician named Priya, who had been kind to everyone she had ever met, forgot how to be a person, and then there was nothing where she had been. 3 Supes were rushed to the facility within minutes. They had been chosen for their combat records, their public appeal, and the fact that they were, at that moment, in the city. 2 of them died within their first 30 seconds inside the corridor. The third, a woman who could turn her skin to living stone, managed to strike the creature once before it did something to her that could not be undone by any surgeon and could not be described by any survivor. Vought's crisis response protocols engaged automatically. The upper floors of the facility were evacuated. The story given to the outside world was a chemical leak. A perimeter was thrown up. Cameras were confiscated. Reporters were paid, threatened, or both. And in a private conference room 50 stories above the incident, Homelander stood in front of a screen watching grainy footage of the thing that had come through the hole and, for the first time in a very long time, He felt an emotion he did not entirely recognize. It was not fear. He was too proud for that. It was something adjacent to fear. It was the recognition that a piece had entered the game that would not respond to his rules. He could not intimidate this. He could not seduce this. He could not appear on a talk show and smile until this went away. It was not looking for approval. It was not even looking at him. It was simply looking in every direction at once for more. Dante was on a rooftop across the river when he felt it. He did not need cameras to know. He turned his head slowly toward the facility, and the smile that lived so easily on his face slid away and did not return. Huey, who was standing beside him with a bag of takeout, saw the change and felt in his stomach the small, cold certainty that some line had just been crossed. Dante began to move. He did not run. He walked, quickly, the way a doctor walks toward an emergency. He spoke as he moved, more to himself than to Huey, describing what he was sensing in short, flat sentences. The portal was unstable. It had been forced open, not born. Something on the other side had noticed. If it stayed open much longer, it would not stay small. And the things that would come through next would not be curious. They would be hungry, and they would be organized. The boys assembled in a way they had never assembled before, not out of trust, but out of necessity. Butcher, who had spent his life refusing to work with anyone who wore a costume, found himself standing beside a man in a red coat and giving him coordinates. Mother's Milk laid out evacuation routes across the district. Frenchie prepared explosives that everyone in the room privately doubted would do anything, but which he insisted on carrying anyway, because in his experience, doing something was always better than doing nothing. Kimiko, without being asked, positioned herself between the facility and the nearest school. Dante entered the portal alone. He did not announce it. He did not ask permission. He walked through the ruined lower corridors of the facility, past the places where reality itself had begun to soften, and, when he reached the room where the hole had first opened, he stepped through without ceremony, coat trailing behind him. The space on the other side was not a place the way places are places. It was a corridor of pressures and colors that did not belong to any spectrum human eyes had ever been trained to see. Distant shapes moved through it. Voices that were not voices whispered in a language that felt older than language. Dante walked through it with the calm expertise of a man who had walked through many such places before. And as he walked, he began to notice something that changed everything. The breach was not random. It had a shape. It had intent. Someone or something had built it, and the construction bore signs of deliberate craftsmanship. Runes he half recognized had been carved into the fabric of the passage. Anchors had been placed at precise intervals. The dimensional wound was not an accident of Vought's clumsy experimentation. Vought's experiments had merely been the key that fit an existing lock. He followed the anchors backward, tracing them the way a hunter traces a wire. And each anchor led him closer to a signature he began, slowly, to recognize. The signature was not demonic. Not entirely. It was mixed. Half made of the old darkness he knew, and half made of something else, something distinctly of this world. Something corporate, something insured, something branded. By the time he stepped back through the hole into the ruined lab, dust settling on his shoulders and the great sword humming quietly at his back, Dante had understood a truth that would change the shape of everything that came next. The person who had opened the door to this new hell had been using Vought's own infrastructure to do it. And they had not finished yet. The rain had not been forecast, but it came anyway that evening, in thin sheets over the city, softening every streetlight into a small halo. It fell on the smoking ruin of the Vought facility. It fell on the roofs where the boys were positioning themselves in silence. It fell on the shoulders of a man in a red coat walking slowly across a cracked parking lot, and on the polished cape of another man descending from the sky to meet him. If a stranger had wandered by, they might have mistaken the scene for a painting, some old canvas of two figures standing at the edge of a storm. They would not have known that the painting was about to move. Homelander landed 30 feet in front of Dante. His boots did not splash. The water simply parted around him as though it too had learned to be afraid. His hair was perfect. His uniform was perfect. His voice, when it came, was almost gentle. He said that Dante had become a problem. He said that Dante had become too powerful, too public, too influential, and that a man like himself could not be expected to allow such a thing to continue. He listed the reasons the way a schoolteacher lists rules, calmly, patiently, with the small smile of a man who believed his own patience made him kind. Dante listened. When Homelander finished, Dante nodded slowly. He said that he had been thinking something very similar, though from the opposite direction. He said that Homelander had become too dangerous to leave alone in a world without anyone tall enough to check him. He said it the way a mechanic tells a customer that a car is no longer safe to drive. They stood there for a long moment, the rain thickening between them. Then Homelander moved. He crossed the 30 feet faster than the rain could register him. His fist arrived at where Dante's head had just been and passed through empty air and struck the pavement so hard that a small crater opened beneath his feet. Dante was already behind him. Rebellion was already out. The first swing of the great sword caught Homelander across the back with enough force to send him through the wall of the ruined facility, through a row of steel lockers, through a corridor, and out the other side of the building. Homelander returned through the hole in the wall a heartbeat later, faster this time, angrier, red light already gathering in his eyes. The heat vision came in twin beams as thick as tree trunks, and Dante answered them with the flat of rebellion, turning the light aside the way a swordsman turns aside a strike, cutting the beams and letting them rake across the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a rain cloud that had been unlucky enough to be in the path of that redirected light quietly ceased to exist. They tore through the block in the minutes that followed. Homelander used speed, strength, and altitude. He picked Dante up and drove him through the concrete pillars of a parking garage. He came back down from 100 feet in the air with an elbow aimed at Dante's spine that would have shattered a lesser man into geometry. Dante rolled aside at the last instant, and the elbow left a crater in the pavement, and Dante, back on his feet, kicked Homelander in the jaw with the casual precision of a man swatting a fly. Dante fought differently than Homelander had ever seen anyone fight. He switched weapons the way a dancer switches partners. He fired ebony and ivory with one hand while cutting with rebellion in the other. When those did not suit the moment, he pulled other weapons from places Homelander could not identify. A nunchaku that hummed with fire, gauntlets that struck like small suns, a scythe that briefly turned the falling rain to steam wherever it passed. He fought as if the battle were a conversation in a language he had spoken all his life, and Homelander, who had never really had to fight in his own life, was suddenly, and for the first time, being asked to keep up. The most infuriating part was the smile. Every time Homelander sent Dante through another wall, Dante got up smiling. Every time Homelander drove him into the pavement, Dante rose from the crater with a joke ready. Every time Homelander tried to intimidate him, Dante offered a compliment, a pun, an observation about the weather. He fought like a man who did not think of the fight as a fight at all, but as a difficult crossword he was determined to finish before bedtime. Homelander expected exhaustion. He watched for it. He waited for the small hitch in the breath, the slight slowing of the reflexes, the moment when even monsters had to rest. It did not come. Dante did not appear to tire. His coat was torn. His face was bloodied. But his eyes were bright, and his voice was steady, and his movements, if anything, were becoming crisper as the fight went on. They rose into the air eventually, because there was no more ground left to break. The battle climbed above the rooftops, above the towers, above the low ceiling of storm cloud that had gathered over the city. Lightning traced the space between them. Fragments of concrete and torn steel fell in slow spirals to the streets below. On the ground, ordinary people stood in doorways and looked up, uncertain whether they were watching a fight or a myth. At some point, high above the city, Homelander lost the last careful edge of his control. He unleashed everything. He struck with a speed and a fury and a naked hatred that he had spent his entire life carefully hiding from the cameras. His eyes burned so brightly the clouds around him boiled away. His voice, when he shouted, cracked windows in buildings a mile below. He was no longer performing power. He was, at last, simply being it. And Dante stopped laughing. The change was small but visible. His eyes darkened by a shade. His shoulders squared. The great sword shifted in his grip. He did not turn into a different man. He turned into the version of himself that had never been meant to be shown in polite company. The version that had walked out of towers of burning demons carrying only a smile and a promise. The version that certain very old and very dangerous things in other worlds had learned, over centuries, not to name aloud. For a brief instant the entire city seemed to fall silent. The rain did not stop, but it seemed quieter. The distant sirens did not stop, but they seemed farther away. Even the wind, which had been howling around the two figures in the sky, paused as if to listen. Then Dante moved. What followed was not a display of superior power. It was a demonstration of superior experience. Every strike Homelander threw was already answered. Every angle Homelander tried had already been anticipated. Dante broke through his guard the way a locksmith breaks through a lock, patiently, mechanically, without flourish. He did not do it instantly. He did not do it easily. But he did it decisively, one deliberate wound at a time, until Homelander, who had never in his life truly bled, found himself hanging in the sky above his own city with his cape torn and his mouth open and no words left inside him. Dante caught him by the collar as he began to fall. He held him there, 100 feet above the streets, in the soft rain. He did not kill him. He looked into Homelander's eyes for a long moment, long enough for Homelander to feel every second of it, and then he simply let him go, carrying him downward gently, setting him on the roof of Vought Tower like a parent setting down a child who had misbehaved. Then Dante walked away. Homelander lay on his own rooftop, in his own rain, and understood that he had just been given the one thing he could not accept. He had been spared, and in that mercy more thoroughly than in any killing blow he had been unmade. The footage of the fight went everywhere. Vaught's control of the media had always been careful, layered, redundant, built on decades of quiet contracts and quieter threats. But there was too much footage this time, taken from too many angles, on too many phones held by too many people who had learned, over the last few weeks, that the man in the red coat did not seem to mind being filmed. Within hours, the video was on every screen in every country. Within a day, it had been watched more times than any Vought commercial in the corporation's history. Within a week, it had become the single most discussed piece of media in the world. The parts people replayed were not the parts Vought would have chosen. They were not the moments of Homelander's strength. They were the moments of Homelander's failure. The small stumble in the air. The torn cape. The way Dante had held him by the collar in the rain and, more devastatingly than any punch, decided he was not worth killing. That last image in particular became something like a symbol. It was printed on shirts. It was painted on walls. It was projected in silent protests outside Vought offices. Somewhere, a small child drew a picture of a man in a red coat lifting a man in a blue cape into the air, and the picture, uploaded innocently by a parent, spread across the world in a single afternoon. Vaught's response was chaotic. Emergency meetings ran through the night. Executives who had never disagreed on anything in 20 years began shouting at each other across long tables. The stock price, which had once been treated by analysts as an eternal law of nature, began to slide. Advertisers began to make quiet calls. Politicians who had spent decades in Vaught's pocket began very carefully to distance themselves. In the middle of all of it, the seven began to fracture. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in small betrayals. One member of the seven stopped returning Homelander's calls. Another began giving interviews in which she spoke cautiously about the importance of accountability. A third simply vanished for a week and reappeared in a country that did not have an extradition treaty with the United States. The team that had once been sold to the world as an unbreakable brotherhood began in front of the world's cameras to look like exactly what it had always been. A group of frightened, powerful people who no longer knew who was in charge. Vaught's counterattack came in the form of propaganda, because propaganda was the only tool the corporation truly understood. A campaign was launched to redefine Dante. He was called an extraterrestrial. He was called a terrorist. He was called an agent of a foreign government, a religious extremist, a corporate saboteur, a hallucination. New commercials appeared, painting him in shadow, warning citizens to report sightings. Editorials were written by columnists whose paychecks Vought quietly signed. For a few days it seemed possible that the old machinery might still work. It did not work. Dante refused to participate. He gave no interviews. He denied no accusations. He allowed the propaganda to wash over him the way rain washes over a stone. When people asked him on the street whether he was any of the things the ads claimed, he simply smiled and asked whether they truly believed the ads. Most of them did not anymore. And each honest answer they gave themselves, alone in their kitchens at night, was another small crack in the wall Vought had spent decades building around their minds. Meanwhile, Dante did something quieter and, in the end, far more dangerous. He began to expose the corporation. He did not do it in speeches. He did it in evidence. Doors that had been sealed for years were suddenly unsealed, with a small polite note left on the inside. Records that had been quietly buried were suddenly quietly unburied. Files were left in the mailboxes of investigative journalists. Photographs appeared on the desks of prosecutors. Whistleblowers who had been terrified for years suddenly found that they were no longer alone, because a man in a red coat had visited them in the evening and told them, gently, that if anyone came for them, he would come for that someone first. Butcher, who had spent his entire life dreaming of exactly this kind of collapse, could hardly believe what he was watching. He accelerated everything. The boys began coordinating with the leaks Dante was producing, giving them shape, timing them for maximum impact, ensuring that no piece of evidence was wasted. Huey found himself sitting across from a network anchor, sliding across the table a folder that would end 3 careers, 5 contracts, and 1 particular product line by the end of the week. Mother's Milk began working with a small group of retired federal agents who had spent the last decade privately preparing for exactly this window of opportunity. Vought could not fight on so many fronts at once. Its lawyers were overwhelmed. Its public relations teams were exhausted. Its executives began to turn on each other. Documents began to leak from inside the tower, from employees who had watched Dante's footage in break rooms and decided, at last, that they no longer wished to be part of the machine. Homelander watched all of it from the top of the tower, and he became something worse than angry. He became small. He had always been the center of gravity of his own world. Rooms had arranged themselves around him. Conversations had rearranged themselves around him. Even the sky, when he flew, had felt like a private property he graciously allowed others to look at. Now, for the first time, he could feel the world's attention moving elsewhere. The billboards that carried his face were being replaced. The news stories that opened with his image were now opening with images of Dante. Even the fear people carried when they thought of him had begun to change shape, no longer the paralyzed fear of a citizen looking up at a god, but the resigned fear of a witness watching a criminal who would eventually be caught. He asked to meet Dante privately. To his own surprise, Dante agreed. They met on the roof of a small, unfamous building in Brooklyn at dusk, in a wind that carried the smell of the sea. Homelander arrived first, standing at the edge of the roof, cape moving gently. Dante arrived on foot, climbing the stairs because he liked stairs. They stood together in silence for a long moment. Finally, Homelander asked the question that had been eating at him since the night in the rain. He asked why Dante was not afraid of him. He asked it quietly, the way a child asks a question in the dark. There was no threat in his voice, and no theatricality either. For a brief, unguarded moment, he was simply a man asking another man to explain something he had not been able to explain to himself. Dante looked at him for a long time. He looked at the perfect uniform and the perfect hair and the perfect blue eyes. And, behind all of those perfect things, the small, frightened boy who had never been allowed to grow up. Then Dante answered. He said it simply, without cruelty, in a voice that was almost kind. He said that he had fought worse. 3 words, that was all. He turned and walked back to the stairs and left Homelander alone on the roof, with those 3 words, and the wind and the sea. Homelander stood there for a long time. He understood, slowly, the shape of what had just been done to him. He was not, in Dante's eyes, an ultimate horror. He was not a final darkness. He was not even a particularly memorable one. He was simply another monster on a long list of monsters, and, more painfully, not near the top of it. That night, alone in his tower, Homelander felt for the very first time like a man who had been outgrown. The dimensional wound over the ruined facility had never fully closed. Vought had built walls around it. They had poured concrete over it. They had told the public it was gone. But at night, when the wind was still and the city was quiet, people who lived within a mile of the site had begun to say that the air near their windows felt heavier, and that their dreams had grown teeth. They were not imagining it. The tear in reality had been patient. It had been waiting. Now it opened. It did not open like a door. It opened like a wound remembers itself. The concrete above it lifted first, then cracked, then rose into the air in pieces that did not fall back down. The walls Vought had built around the site sagged inward as if something were breathing beneath them. And then, in a slow, silent motion that was somehow louder than any explosion, the sky above the site tore open along a seam that ran from horizon to horizon, and something began to come through. It was not a creature. It was not quite a being. It was a presence, an intention, wearing a shape only because shape was the local custom. Its edges did not stay still. Its center could not be looked at directly, because eyes, when they tried, forgot what they were doing and began to weep for reasons the people crying could not name. Where its shadow fell, buildings twisted, streets bent. The lines painted on the pavement began to reroute themselves into symbols that no city planner had ever approved. The effects rippled outward within minutes. Supes across the city began to feel their powers behave in ways that made them afraid of themselves. A woman who could control fire found that the fire she summoned would not extinguish and would not obey. A man who could fly found that the sky itself no longer wanted to hold him and had to grip the edge of a rooftop to keep from falling upward into nothing. Somewhere in a suburb, a small boy whose only power had been the ability to make coins vanish opened his hand and discovered that his hand had vanished with them and that he was not sure how to bring it back. Fear moved through the city faster than any siren. And the entity above the ruined facility, which had come through a door made of Vaught's greed and Dante's residue, fed on that fear the way fires feed on dry grass. Dante understood the shape of what he was looking at before anyone else did. He stood on a rooftop several blocks away and watched the seam widen, and the smile that lived so easily on his face did not appear. He spoke quietly, as if to himself, and named the thing under his breath, using a word that Huey, standing beside him, would later remember only as the shape of a sound, not the sound itself. To close the wound, Dante said, he would have to destroy the gateway. And the gateway, he explained, was no longer only a hole in the air. It had rooted itself, during its long, silent wait, in the strongest source of enhanced energy in the city. It had wrapped its anchor around the very compound V that flowed through the veins of Vaught's greatest asset. Homelander himself had become, without knowing it, part of the door. That was the moment Dante and Homelander were forced into the last kind of alliance either of them had ever expected. The meeting was short. It happened on the same rooftop where Homelander had once asked why he was not feared. There were no cameras, no publicists, no negotiators. Dante explained. Homelander listened. Homelander, whose pride was a nation of its own, hated every syllable of what he was hearing. But he was not stupid. He understood that the thing in the sky did not care about his brand. He understood that if the city fell, there would be no citizens left to admire him. He understood, more painfully, that if he did not stand beside the man who had humiliated him, he would die in a world that had forgotten him first. He agreed with a single tight nod. The final battle unfolded across a New York that no longer looked like itself. Streets curved where they had once run straight. Buildings leaned toward the center of the city as if drawn by gravity, though the ground beneath them had not moved. The boys, working faster than they had ever worked, coordinated evacuations block by block. Butcher took command of a battered radio and became briefly, and against every instinct in his body, a general. Mother's Milk moved through the streets, guiding families to bridges that were still stable. Frenchie carried children out of buildings that were forgetting how to have floors. Kimiko stood at the mouth of a subway entrance and killed, in silence, 3 corrupted Supes who had come to feed on the crowd waiting to descend into the tunnels. Former members of the Seven, some of whom had spent their entire careers pretending to save people, found themselves saving them now for the first time because the cameras had all fled and there was no one left to perform for. It turned out, to their own quiet surprise, that they were slightly better people than the world had been given reason to believe. Not good, just better. It was enough. High above, Homelander turned his full power on the entity. His heat vision at last was aimed at something worthy of it. The beams tore through the thing's skin, or what passed for skin, again and again. Sometimes the thing recoiled. Sometimes it did not. Homelander kept striking and, in a strange way that he would never admit aloud, felt for the first time in his life the honest satisfaction of using his power on something that deserved to be hit. Dante went to the core. He walked into the twisted heart of the wound alone, coat trailing, rebellion drawn, boots leaving small burning footprints on ground that was no longer entirely ground. He passed through corridors of pressure and color, through voices that begged him and voices that mocked him, through echoes of every terrible thing he had ever fought and every terrible place he had ever been. He did not stop. He walked to the center of the gateway, where the anchor sat like a great burning heart, and he began the work of cutting it apart. It was not quick. It was not clean. Each cut required something of him. Old wounds reopened. Old memories rose up and had to be walked through. But he cut and he cut and he cut, and slowly the great burning heart began to fail. Homelander above saw what Dante was doing. He saw the way Dante's coat was becoming heavier with each strike. He saw the way the light around Dante was pulling inward, gathering, preparing to close. He saw, with the terrible clarity of a man who has been raised on stories of gods, exactly what Dante intended. Dante intended to close the door from the inside. Homelander stared at the burning core for a long moment. He was not a good man. He would never be a good man. He knew this about himself, with a clarity that would have surprised the people who most feared him. But somewhere, buried beneath decades of performance, there was still a small, stubborn piece of him that had once wanted, more than anything, to be part of something that mattered. He flew down. He did not say a word. He simply took position beside Dante at the burning core, planted his boots on a floor that was no longer really a floor, and began to strike the anchor with everything he had. His heat vision poured into it. His fist slammed into it. His voice, when it came, was not a speech. It was a scream. And in that scream, for perhaps the first time in his life, he was not asking to be admired. Together they broke the gateway. The entity was pulled back, howling in a register no ear was ever meant to hear. The sky closed with a sound like a great door slamming very far away. The building straightened. The streets remembered themselves. The city, battered and burning and stunned, was still there. But when the light cleared, Dante was gone. The weeks after did not feel like victory. They felt like the strange quiet after a long fever, when a person walks slowly through their own house and touches familiar objects, as if seeing them for the first time. New York rebuilt itself in small daily gestures, in the sweeping of glass from a sidewalk, in the reopening of a coffee shop, in the way strangers now sometimes nodded at each other on the subway, as if remembering that they had all survived the same thing. Vought did not fall completely. Corporations that are large rarely fall completely, but it was broken in ways it would never fully hide. Its executive board changed 3 times in a single month. Its stock never returned to what it had been. Contracts were canceled. Investigations were opened. Public trust, once a resource Vought had believed it owned outright, quietly moved elsewhere. And the corporation spent the rest of its diminished life trying to earn back a fraction of it. The Seven, as it had once existed, was gone. Some of its members went to prison. Some retired to Island. Some disappeared into private lives they had never expected to be allowed to have. A new team was eventually assembled, smaller, quieter, less confident, and the world watched them with an eye it had never trained on a superhero team before, an eye that expected them to earn respect rather than demand it. Butcher continued his work. He would never truly stop, but he did it now with a small crease at the edge of his mouth that had not been there before, a quiet awareness that he had briefly, and against every principle he had ever claimed to hold, worked with a stranger in a red coat, and had not entirely hated it. Huey went back to being Huey, which is to say, he went back to being the small, brave person he had always been, only slightly less afraid of the size of the world. Homelander survived. He healed. He returned to public appearances. His smile came back in his cape and his slogans. But something inside him had changed shape, and he knew it, and no amount of makeup could quite cover it. Every time he heard thunder in the distance, he remembered a smile in the rain. Every time a shadow moved oddly in a corner of his tower, his eyes went to it a half-second faster than they used to. He did not sleep any less than before, but he slept differently. And then, one gray afternoon, a small dimensional anomaly appeared over the harbor outside New York. It was not violent. It was not loud. It was a soft ripple in the air, the way a curtain moves when a familiar person opens a door in a house they used to live in. A single figure stepped out of it and landed on the roof of a warehouse, brushing dust from a long red coat. The boys found him within the hour. He was sitting on the edge of the roof with his boots dangling over the water, eating something wrapped in paper, complaining cheerfully about the mustard. Huey sat down beside him. Butcher stood a few feet away, arms folded, pretending not to be relieved. Kimiko smiled her small, quiet smile. Dante talked about food. He talked about how he had gotten lost somewhere on the way back, and how the trip through the fold had taken longer than expected, and how the coffee in the other place had, unfortunately, been slightly better than the coffee here. Huey eventually asked, in a voice that was more hopeful than he wanted it to be, whether Dante was staying. Dante looked out at the city. He looked at the towers he had helped save. He looked at the skyline where a certain billboard quietly and without announcement had recently been taken down. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said no. He said that this world still had problems. But he said with something warm and certain in his voice that this world also had people willing to fight them. He looked at Howie when he said it. He looked at Butcher. He looked at Kimiko. He did not need to explain who he meant. He left one final message before he went. Not for the boys, for Homelander. He asked Huey to deliver it, and he said it in the plain, unhurried voice of a man passing on a promise. If Homelander ever, in any small moment in any private corridor, began to become something truly monstrous, Dante would know. And Dante would come back. He stood. He tipped an imaginary hat. He stepped into the small, soft ripple in the air, and the ripple closed behind him without any drama at all. That night in Vought Tower, Homelander stood alone in his office. The lights flickered once and went out. Somewhere in the darkness below the tower, a single motorcycle engine coughed to life, echoed briefly through the empty streets, and then faded. He turned toward the window. Nothing was there. Then a small grin appeared on his face. Because for the first time in his life, he finally understood exactly what fear felt like. Homelander had spent his entire life convincing the world that he was a god. Then Dante arrived and reminded him what gods were supposed to fear.